Okay. This is Q&A. Yeah.
Do you know the mathematician Fibonacci and
Yeah.
his golden ratio and all the things that it applies to in nature and like the world? Is there any source from that coming from the Torah that's not for any?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
Not that I know of. There's very little pure mathematics in the Torah altogether.
Right. But there's nothing that shows like the golden ratio or like the patterns of the golden ratio?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Yeah.
Were the 7 days of creation literal?
Yeah, the 7 days of creation were literal. There's I think it's on my blog. Rabbi Tzvi Lampel put together the sources from Rishonim and Achronim on the subject, and maybe the ratio is 50-3 or something like that. I mean, the vast majority, including the Rambam, the Ramban, others, will tell you that it's literally 24-hour periods. Yeah.
Also, so what are the main categories, you would say, of like Torah interpretations, and how do they differ from maybe literary interpretations?
The main categories of Torah interpretations and how they differ from literary interpretations. Wow. I'm glad we're scheduled to go tonight until 11:30, because
11:30?
that was a joke. That was a
AM or
joke.
PM?
Huh? Yeah, AM or PM, he says. Yeah, right. I'll only say a couple of things about it. It's a very broad topic. First of all, I think one has to be careful with the word interpretation. Of course, all these words are vague and used in multiple ways by different people, but I think the word interpretation calls up the idea that there are words in this text, and we're trying to explain what they mean. What they mean. It sounds like there's something they mean, and you can get this wrong. I know postmodernism and deconstructionism, I'm aware of all that stuff. I have good reasons, I think, not to take that seriously. Now, talking about what the words mean, and the sentences, and the paragraphs, and the context, and all the rest, is really subject to the cultural definition of the use of the piece of literature that you're interpreting. So there's a gigantic difference between interpreting an encyclopedia and interpreting a play by Shakespeare and interpreting poetry by Edgar Allan Poe. You can call them all interpretations, but what they will say about the text differs considerably, because those three pieces of literature that I just mentioned are used for very different purposes. Roughly, an encyclopedia is used for explaining facts, describing and explaining facts. A play is used to portray something about the nature of human life. And poetry is used to evoke certain types of emotions or ideas. And if, for example, someone complained that a certain passage in a piece of literature was very redundant, sometimes that would be a critical condemnation of the work, and sometimes it would be praise of the work. Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Bells, used the word bells about 100 times, and you don't learn anything from the 79th bells and to the 86th bells, and different kinds of bells, color bells, ball ones. No, it's meant to evoke. By the time you finish hearing this poem read well, you can hear the bells. They're ringing in your head. So interpretation is an explanation of what the words are supposed to be doing according to the cultural context of the piece of literature. That's one point. And the second point is that a lot of what texts do doesn't depend upon interpretation at all. It's wrong to say that what you're doing when you talk about the text and comment on the text and explain some of the things the text is accomplishing is interpretation. For example, let's suppose that spies are using this text to communicate hidden information by connecting every third letter into a text of its own. That's not interpreting the text. That's uncovering hidden information that's stored in the text. They used to have a technique called microdot, that you could take a whole page of text and store it in a period at the end of a sentence by miniaturizing it. If you happen to know which one it is, then you'll discover a lot by opening up that microdot. That's not interpreting the text. Now, the Torah communicates in many different ways at the same time. Each of the modes of communication depends upon a particular methodology of dealing with the text to uncover the communication in the text. I wouldn't call that interpretation. I would call that decoding. And there are 4 main ways that you get information in the text, one of which is called pshat, could perhaps be described with the word interpretation, but Remesh, Drush, and Soda certainly are not, nor the 70 faces that the Torah has, certainly not. So I don't think interpretation is the right word to use here. I think it'd be very misleading. That's one thing. And the other thing is that when you talk about literary interpretation also has a variety of dimensions that it takes upon itself to account for. I don't know if there's a fixed list, or you could discover new lists. I think it's fair to say that any dimension of a text that would be literarily relevant could be applied to the Torah text. Maybe there are cases where there'd be reason to reject it, but it's certainly fair. If, for example, the Torah seems to play with a word, it says, Joseph says to the wine steward, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. There, lift up your head means take you into account and make a decision concerning you. It's a poetic way of saying concern and decision. Then when he speaks to the baker, he says, Pharaoh will lift up your head from off your shoulders. Well, that's not what it meant when he talked to the wine steward. It didn't mean there meant paying attention and making a decision. Here it means killing you. So in one case you have a figurative expression for paying attention. In the other case, the same words are used with literal, brutal interpretation. And you look at that and you say, oh man, that's really tough, using the same words. That's not a joke. It is tough. It is tough. Could it be that Joseph wanted to mislead the baker into thinking he's going to get some good treatment because he starts with the same words that he started with respect to the cupbearer? Yes, it could. So that kind of sensitivity to the psychology of what's going on is a relevant sensitivity. I think it's relevant to ask questions based on that kind of literary sensitivity. Again, there may be reasons to reject it, but it's not irrelevant, not a mistake. So in that sense, yes, I think it's certainly relevant to start with those types of sensitivities. And if you read the text carefully with the commentaries, you'll learn other sensitivities that you weren't aware of. That's what I said, yeah.
So I have a quick question. So as far as pretty much by the end of Miketz, where they find in Binyamin's bag the goblet, and I remember he said that Paro also used that for divination. And during that time, Yosef seemed like he was kind of sort of doing things that kind of hinted that he knows a lot more about the brothers than seems to be like letting on. And both him and Rivka are like sons of, both him and Benjamin are sons of Rivka, who she ran away with Laban's like idol, which she also used for divination. Do you think that was like another like hint they was trying to dig at the brothers, or just kind of like coincidence, sort of?
I see. I'm trying to get the chronology straight here.
Oh, yeah,
What happened with Joseph?
yeah.
But let's get the facts straight. It wasn't Pharaoh that was doing divination. It was Joseph, and it wasn't Joseph that was doing divination because he's very careful. The servant he sends out to chase the brothers says, "Didn't you know that my master uses this cup for divination?" That's what the servant says. But when they come back and face Joseph, he says to them, "Didn't you know that someone like me would do divination with this cup?" He's very careful not to say that he does divination. Someone like me, someone in my position, someone who has my seniority and my riches, my power, someone like me would be. Didn't you know that? Of course, they hear he means himself, but he didn't say it. He's very careful to say what's true. Just like with the money, when they get the money back in the sacks, right? They're afraid that it's a plant and they're going to be taken to task for it. And they say, "We're sorry, we don't know what happened." So he says to them, "Have no fear. Your money reached me." That's true. Of course, I put it back also. That I'm not telling you. But your money did reach me. Everything he said is true. The text is extremely careful not to say anything that isn't true. That's number one. Now, this happened many years after the incident with Rachel stealing the trophy of her father. So, if they're going to be related, they can't be related that Rachel's somehow registering what Joseph did. What Joseph did was after what she did. So I'm not sure what kind of connection you're offering now.
And I was just wondering if he knew, or if the brothers or any of them kind of knew about that sort of event. He was trying to just use that as kind of like a hint, because before that he even ordered the brothers around the table in order of ages to kind of
Yes.
So I'm wondering if maybe that was sort of something.
Well, again, that happened before the cup.
Yeah.
So I don't hear the connections that you're sort of asserting. And I will say something else because other people asked me about this year. If you look at the brothers, it's quite clear how they see things. They see that this zhlub of the Egyptian is a dope and a jerk and of no account to them. Everything is divine providence. Everything is divine providence. When he attacks them, they say, "I know why he's attacking us. Not because we came in through 10 gates, or not because we didn't dress in the right Egyptian clothes styles. No, we're guilty because we didn't have pity on our brother, and God is punishing us." And when they find the money in the sacks, they say, "What is this that Hashem has done to us? Because we don't deserve rewards. We deserve punishment." So to read him and to see him, he's nobody. He's nothing. If he did it this way, it's because God was manipulating him to do it that way, not because he's somebody special. They don't see him as somebody special at all. And by the way, I think Joseph plays into this for them, because when the first time he puts him in jail, he says to them twice, "No one's leaving here until your brother comes down." Hey, Pharaoh, by the life of Pharaoh, he says twice, by the life of Pharaoh, no one's leaving. On the third day, he calls them out and says, "I changed my mind. I fear God." "Oh, really? But what about the fact that you swore by Pharaoh's life? That's nothing? You could just snap your fingers and erase that? Or maybe you're not so clever, don't think things through. You're a little superficial. What Pharaoh finds out about this, you swore by his name twice and then you just ignored it? You might get into he's not portraying himself as someone that they have to deal with. And they don't feel they have to deal with him. They're dealing with the Kodesh Baruch Hu. So I don't think it's going to hang together as a strand of consistent information to draw a conclusion from. I could be wrong, but that's what I think. Yeah.
Kind of going back on the interpretation question I had before, do you ever have maybe paradigm shifts in the same way, in interpretations or halachic rulings in the same way that we may see in science or we may see in philosophy when it comes to the Torah?
I'll tell you, there's a problem here. We're talking about paradigm shifts and interpretations, so on. All we have is what's written down. There was always an oral tradition. As we have mentioned many times, the oral Torah precedes the written Torah. Comes first, not afterwards. Wasn't invented to interpret. Okay, so now, Rashi dedicated himself to explaining Pshat. The word Pshat is found in the Gemara 800 years or more before Rashi. He didn't invent Pshat. Rashi is among the earliest commentaries that we possess. That doesn't mean there weren't commentaries from before. Rashi quotes his teachers over and over again. He had teachers who taught him how to learn Chumash. So to talk about a paradigm shift requires you to know a considerable amount of history, both what did exist at a certain time and what didn't exist at that time. I think it's very hard to know what didn't exist when you know that a sizable portion of the information was oral. Very hard to say that it didn't exist at that time. This, by the way, is a prejudice throughout so-called academic historical studies of history of Judaism. They'll date an idea to the earliest text in which it is found. That's, you'll excuse me, dumb. If a tradition has a sizable oral portion, then what you could say is it's not later than that. But you can't say it's not earlier than that. When they claim that we copied from other ancient traditions, why do you say that we copied from them? Maybe they copied from us because their text is earlier than your text. So what? So what? Ideas don't date back to texts. They date back at least to the text, but they can be much older than the text. So I think we have to talk about shifts in styles or paradigm shifts in interpretation. You'd have to know with great accuracy what didn't exist at a particular time to talk about a shift. And it's very difficult to know that. Yeah.
Why is it a silly question to ask, why do you do what you enjoy?
Why is it a silly question to ask, why do you do what you enjoy? Well, I don't mean that it's always a serious, silly question. And indeed, I think I was careful when I gave that lecture to say every time, in some cases, there might be an answer. For example, you might do what you enjoy to lower your blood pressure. That might be, right? But it's also appropriate sometimes for the person to say, why are you asking? I enjoy it. It means that I enjoy it is an appropriate stopping place for why. You don't need to go on. Whereas if somebody asks somebody, why are you working at this job? And he says, to earn money. He says, why do you want to earn money? He said, oh, that's a dumb question. No, if that question doesn't apply, then there's something seriously wrong. Because people work to earn money for a purpose. They don't work to earn money. That's not an appropriate stopping place. Because money, in normal people's psychology, is a means to get something else. But there are some things which, in normal psychology, sometimes are appropriate places to stop. You don't do it for the sake of something else. So all I wanted to establish there is that there are chains of why, and it's not always appropriate to force a new why question. Not always appropriate. Sometimes you can, but not always. And this is, to encourage a person to outgrow being 7 years old. I know that's tough for 22-year-olds, but I encourage it, right? He says, why? Well, why that? No, so why that? Okay, that's good when you're 7, but by the time you're 8, you got to figure out that's if you have that attitude, you're guaranteeing you'll never get an answer because you're not satisfied with anything that you've heard. So you have to recognize that why questions have natural stopping places where the question why doesn't always apply to go on further. That's all I wanted. It's a fairly minimal conclusion. That's all I was trying to do. Yeah.
But the question that rose in my mind was to try to ask, why did Hashem design humans to enjoy pleasure?
Well, let's try that. That's a new question for me. Why did Hashem design humans to enjoy pleasure, or to experience pleasure? Enjoy pleasure is probably redundant. That's a really deep question. By the way, I think that I thought about this also in evolutionary terms. Some things that you do for survival are motivated by pleasure, and some things that you do for survival are motivated by pain. Not obvious to me which is which or why they should be that way. Reproduction is motivated largely by a desire for pleasure. Eating is motivated by pain. Being hungry is very unpleasant. You're under pressure and so forth and so on, right? So, why? Both of them are necessary for survival and survival of the species. Why, if we switched, it would be different? Is it? I wouldn't even guarantee that in every organism it is that way. Maybe both are pain, maybe both are pleasure, maybe it's reversed. I have no sense of the logic of it. But your question you ask is very important because the world to come is described as pleasure. So it's not a joke, and pleasure can't be the enemy. Means enjoying the shine of God's presence. So enjoyment, at least on some level, is the purpose of all of our existence, to get to a position of enjoyment. So it's very, if you ask, but we could have created us without that feature, I don't even know how to begin to answer the question. I don't even know where to go to look. I guess the point is like this. I had the pleasure of having private lessons from a professor when I was here as an undergraduate, as a graduate student. And he said, ice floats in water. What would be if ice didn't float, if it sank to the bottom of the cup? So people talk about that. In the wintertime, the ice would form on the top of a river and would sink to the bottom where it's protected from, and then it would freeze solid, and all the fish would die, and most of the vegetation would die. But he said like this, let's see, if ice sinks to the bottom of your cup instead of floating on top, what happens to the laws of chemistry? Are the laws the same or not? Well, if the laws are different so that the ice will really sink, what else is going to be different? Maybe you won't be able to breathe air. Maybe gravity will go to pot. I mean, who knows what else, what implications there are. It means that what if X may have no answer at all because things are connected in such a way that you can't predict what will happen if X happens. I think that's a very serious problem. So here, you have to imagine something about the general purpose for which he created us, subtract pleasure, and see whether what? Human beings minus pleasure, but what would that do to desire? What would that do to fear? What would that do to self-preservation? I mean, it could change a great deal more than we're realizing, and we will get a concrete answer to it. We'll be able to analyze it through and find the right answer. So I think it's a dangerous problem of what if it were different. There are lots of problems with what if it were different. If Mozart had been born, if Mozart were French, would he speak French or German? Mozart. If he spoke French, would he be Mozart or somebody else? These are tough questions. Philosophy, puts question marks on them. Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit the idea of Yeush and how we can sort of overcome it?
Yeush. Yeah. I can say a little bit about it. I'm not trained in psychology, not even Torah psychology. But I think Yeush is sometimes translated as despair, giving up. Now, there are certain things that a human being is designed to accomplish, certain goals which represent success in his life, and certain traps which represent failure. One thing you should do when you're evaluating something is ask, if this happens, what happens to the goals? Here's a simple example. People talk about, is God just? Is God merciful? Does God really appreciate what I do, what I don't do? Is God watching me, and so forth and so on? One thing to ask is, if I take a position on this subject, will I do more mitzvos or less mitzvos? I'll do less mitzvos, then be very wary, be very cautious. Because the motivation for taking that position can be laziness, it could be a desire to throw off responsibility, and it's destructive. It's destructive. So you ask, well, what will the consequences of it be? So, Yeush is where you lose all your energy and all your self-confidence to move forward. Yeush means giving up. Giving up means I can't handle it. I can't do it. It's too big for me. I failed so many times. I don't believe that I'll be able to succeed. Those thoughts mean you're not going to try. Well, that's death. That's death. So that's really an enemy. Hasidic Sforim talk about it a lot. Some Muslim Sforim talk about it. That you definitely want to avoid. Now, there are a number of different ways to avoid it depending upon what's causing it. Often, what causes it is unrealistic expectations about yourself, or unrealistic pictures of what the Torah wants from you. It used to be more common, but it still happens now. Someone comes into the yeshiva, someone with really no Jewish education. What does he hear all day? This is the law. The law. This is what you're supposed to do, have to do. Commandments. There's a commander and there are commandments. Okay, he's got a notebook. Oh, he's very careful. He writes down. You have to do this and this. Huh? Every day he fills 2 or 3 pages. End of the week, counts up. 47 new commandments. Whew. And last week was 38. We're kind of getting close to 100 in 2 weeks. Then he gets to a point where he says, but I can't do this. I cannot do this. It's impossible. And then he says, well then, if that's what God wants for me and I can't do it, what am I doing here? There's no hope for me. What I try to tell people is, when you make out your notebook, the title of the notebook is Things to Try to Get to Someday. Not what I have to do by this evening. These are things which it is good to do, or the things that you're obligated to do, but not right away, not immediately. Or more subtly, you're obligated, but there's no penalty for not doing it. That's anti-Kantian. Okay, that's for the people who know. I think that's absolutely correct. Then, if you understand, I used to tell guys that they should think like the anthropologists. You're visiting a new culture. You're observing a new culture. Take down notes. You want to remember what you've observed, remember what you're experiencing. There'll come a point in time where you will try to think, what can I learn about this new culture that I'm observing? What can I learn about it? Should I want to grow in that direction? Should I not want to grow in that direction? But give yourself distance. Because otherwise, you won't give it a fair chance. And I think it's quite realistic to say you're not going to be able to do everything at once. Suppose you decided at age 21, it's very important for me to be able to speak Chinese. Would you demand that you get there by tomorrow morning? Why not? It's very important. Okay, but it's speaking Chinese. So everybody knows that takes time, because Baruch Hu knows it also takes time. That's one way to avoid yush. If the yush is coming from the sense of overwhelmingly impossible obligation, and therefore I say simply can't do it, that's one thing. If the yush is coming, I'm not going to give a whole catalog, but I'll give you a couple of examples so you can see there's a great variety here. If the yush is coming from, let's say, a particular problem, and you've been working on the problem for a long time, and you don't seem to be making any progress. You're like, okay, maybe other things, and I'm doing well in some other things, but this is just beyond. Beyond is hopeless. So this especially happens when you're coming up to Yom Kippur, and you think, oh, Yom Kippur. What am I going to confess in Yom Kippur? I remember Q. I'm going to confess Q because last year and 5 years ago and 10 years ago, 20 years, I was confessing Q every year. And it's another Yom Kippur, and I'm confessing Q again. And the thought is, well, I'm just not making any progress, and this is just hopeless. So I used to say, but every year has gone by. And a year is a long time, and you're not exactly the same person you were then. So you shouldn't be closed-minded to think that this year couldn't be different. But I saw in the Yeshivat Shalom a few years ago a deeper idea, and that is the very fact that you still care about it, the very fact that you're still struggling with it, means that you're still spiritually alive. You're only spiritually dead when you give up. And that means you can credit yourself with a kind of victory. So I read that and I thought to myself, I know what's written in some of the Muslims Forum. They write this: you want to know whether a fish is alive or dead, go to a moving stream, toss it in the water. If it goes upstream, it's alive. If it goes downstream, could very well be that it's floating with the current and just floating downstream. It could be dead. That's what they say. And then they say, every person is either going upstream or downstream. There's no neutral. Nothing that's static. So I thought, really? There's nothing that's static? You think of what mitzvahs a person's doing, how well he's davening, how much kavanah that he has, clear mind and focused mind when he does mitzvahs. It's not possible to remain at the same level. You're always going up or down. I didn't see why that would have to be true. But then I think I thought of a solution. Let me ask you, if the fish is going upstream, it's alive. Going downstream, it could very well be dead and be floating in the water. What happens if the fish is staying at the same place in the stream? What is it?
Going up.
It's staying at the same place in the stream.
It's alive. It's trying to move.
What am I asking? I said this way it's alive, this way it's dead. So I'm asking whether it's alive or dead.
Oh.
Yeah. So what must it be? It's got to be alive, because if we're dead, it'd be floating downstream. It's not going up in the water. Listen, it's not going up in the water, but it's fighting the current, isn't it? That fish is alive. So if I take their image and just add this one feature, then I say there's a difference between what's called chitzonis, what's called pnimius. Externally, you may indeed be staying in the same place. The fish is not going upstream or downstream. But internally, you're still fighting. You're getting stronger. Your muscles are being used. The effort's being put forward. That's not nothing. So I would say, when they say you're either going up or down, it means internally. Either you're strengthening yourself or you're weakening yourself. But that doesn't mean your performance goes up or down. Your performance could be in the same place. So if you come to the 23rd Yom Kippur in a row, and you're still confessing the same thing, if you're still spiritually alive, you still care about it, you're still fighting, you're going up because internally you're making yourself stronger. It may take a while, other circumstances, for that internal strengthening to show itself. It may not be enough yet to change the external behavior, but that's where it counts, where the remark that you're either going up or down really counts. It doesn't count in your external behavior, it counts in what's going on internally in spiritual terms. So that's another way to avoid that kind of use. There are many, many different kinds of use, and that's just an example of a couple. Yeah.
I asked the Rabbi a question a couple of weeks back about medicine, how he works with God. And the Rabbi said that it's God doing all of it, but in studies he'll sort of take a step back, I think I'm remembering correctly, and therefore just sort of let the nature play out with the drug.
Let's go through this slowly. I don't remember. We're talking about medicine.
Yeah, and how interact with that? Is it God or is it the medicine?
Is it God or is it the medicine? Meaning, he takes the medicine and he's cured, and then where does the causality come from?
Yeah.
So
is there anything intrinsic within the medicine that's actually curing you as well?
Well, intrinsic. I mean, the medicine is a creation of God. So he can make something that's in it. It's not subject to other factors, maybe, but it didn't make itself. The medicine didn't create itself. So if intrinsic means without God's input, surely not. Surely not. Medicine can't do anything that God didn't give it the power to do. So I know it's what work the word intrinsic is going to do here.
I mean, the development of a new drug, would that actually make a difference if the guy survives or not?
Well, it might, because let me back up a little bit, and maybe you'll see where I would come from to answer this question. Rav Dessler says that all of what we call, Rav Dessler and the Chazon Ish and many others say that what we call nature is an illusion. Everything is divine activity. Chazon Ish says the word nature stands for God's will that expresses itself in repetitive patterns. And miracle is a word for God's will expressing itself without repetitive patterns. It's all God's will expressing itself, all of it. Okay? And therefore, nothing really in the physical world makes something else happen. It isn't as if I let it go, it's got to fall. God is making the universe function moment by moment, detail by detail. And that's the way he does it. He does it in these patterns. But then people ask me, well, if it isn't really causality, if it isn't that my releasing the stone makes the stone fall, why should I study science? Science tells me what causes what, which, as the footnote, is false, because all the laws of science don't mention causality. The word cause isn't in science at all. You have mathematical descriptions of sequences of events, and that's all there is. But okay, leave that aside. We think of science telling us what causes what, right? And if that's what science tells us, you tell me there's no causality, so there'll be no point in studying it. No, that's not correct, because God is committed to the patterns, at least when you're looking. He's committed to you seeing patterns take place. So, since he's committed to making those patterns, at least for you to observe, when you make a new medicine and you've tested chemically they have these and these properties, he wants those patterns to be preserved and people will get well, because that's part of the patterns that he's invested in. Those are the kind of patterns that he wants to take place. So it could be because he's committed to those patterns. If you don't invent a new drug, the person will die. When you do invent a new drug, the person will live, because he's committed to those patterns. But it's always because he's committed to those patterns.
And would the Rav not then be saying that if you had a patient, it could be, it's saying it's also dependent on not just whether God decides the guy is going to live or die, it's also dependent on whether you give him the correct medicine.
It depends upon whether you give him the correct medicine, because God wants the same patterns to repeat. And we know what happens when you give him the wrong medicine for this kind of medical problem. You give this medicine, we know it's fatal. So knowing that that's the medicine that he got, and it's in the records, and it's going to be discovered, of course he wants him to die because he got the wrong medicine, because he's committed to those patterns. But you can't factor out his commitment to the patterns. Yeah. I'm sorry. I don't have one. Go ahead, yeah.
I receive pleasure from knowing that my stomach or headaches will earn me reward in the next world if I accept the suffering with joy. In my lifetime, will it be possible that I'll not only feel the pleasure in my head from the thought, but I'll actually feel the pleasure from the stomach ache or the headache?
Boy, it was close. I'm not quite sure that we got the question clear. Let's rehearse it. There is when a person is suffering, one thing, maybe it accompanies it every time, to do is to say, to accept it with love. Okay, there were Tanoim who wanted to avoid the suffering. They felt it was too damaging, but okay. But that's something to do, accept it with love. Now you say, accept it with love, I know, could have an effect on my status in the world to come. Yes, I think that's correct. So I can have the pleasure of knowing that in the world to come, I'm building myself a better reward by accepting the present suffering with love. That's certainly true. Now you ask whether there could, in addition to that, be something else. Now, one step, a baby step forward would be, could I have actually an experience of spiritual pleasure in this world from the fact that I'm accepting the sufferings with love, without just projecting it intellectually onto the next world? That was what you said. But so that's a baby step forward. It's always good to go by baby steps, right? And I think that you certainly could. You certainly could, and it would be appropriate to feel that pleasure. Pleasure in doing a mitzvah, pleasure in serving a Kodesh Baruch Hu is very appropriate. And therefore, this is a way of serving a Kodesh Baruch Hu, so you can definitely feel it. Now you say, could I have pleasure in the stomach ache? Now, I'm not quite sure exactly what that means. If it's an ache, there's pain there.
At first.
Oh, you mean it should disappear? But then there won't be any reward for it, because it's not pain.
So?
But then you're not describing the same situation.
It's 5 seconds of pain. I do the mental exercise, and the pain goes away because I've converted the mental pleasure of my Olam Haba reward somehow back into my body.
But let's see, if you, but that means after the 5 seconds, you won't be earning any more reward. So it's only for the reward that you got for the 5 seconds?
Yeah, we're not supposed to cause ourselves, inflict pain on ourselves if we could help it.
We're not supposed to cause pain for ourselves if we can help it. I guess everything's going to be built in if we can help it. There are those who said that because they have done things wrong, they need to experience pain. There are those who said that in order to break certain bad habits, they need to experience pain. So now, if we can help it, now could have lots of exceptions, right? Cases where pain would be appropriate. And if, as Rashi seems to say, it's complicated, Rashi and Brachos, Yisurim Shel Ahava, that pain adds to your reward in the world to come, just the pain itself, then I don't see that there would be any problem in looking for that pain, any more than, for example, trying to pass a very difficult test in doing a mitzvah, which is very, very hard, and will cause you pain in enduring it. If a Baruch Hu promises you reward for something, that means he thinks it's a good thing to do. So there's no reason why you couldn't volunteer to have that kind of pain in order to show to a Baruch Hu that you accept it with love, and in that way to have pain. The idea that you don't cause yourself pain is only if by relieving the pain you don't lose anything. But in this case, you're talking about losing something. So I don't see the... I would say gratuitous pain, just for the sake of showing, there's enough important things to do that are painful, where the pain would be together with doing something important and good, and then it would be much more fruitful to use that kind of pain than just stick yourself with pins.
If Plony gets a stomachache, shouldn't his next action be to take medicine?
He should take medicine because what he can do without the stomachache is much better than what he can do with the stomachache. But that's the difference. That's the that's an nafkamina. Whether in fact what he can do, he can do better. The Tanoim had this. The Tanoim suffered terrible pains at the ends of their lives, and other Tanoim came to visit them and to comfort them, and in some cases they said, "Lo hem velo scharam." I don't want them, and I don't want their reward. And others didn't say that. So it depended upon what they felt that they could do in the condition that they were in.
So if the pain stops me from going to Gemara class in the morning, the next step should be to take the medicine.
100%.
So instead of taking a medicine, my question is, is it possible to cure myself through converting that spirit?
Is it possible to convert yourself by converting the... I don't see why not. I mean, you're asking a psychological question, not a philosophical question. Whether it's possible. A great deal of your experience depends upon your mental set. I'll just give you a parallel. This is a loose parallel, but can you control your thoughts? So people say, well, I could be responsible for controlling how I respond to a thought that occurs to me. But I can't be responsible for what thoughts occur to me. It's on my hands to determine what thoughts will occur to me. Well, yes, it is. The way you control your thoughts is to fill your mind with certain thoughts so full that nothing else can get in. If that sounds a little extravagant and fanciful to you, think about learning with the Chavrusa. I don't think, it's my experience, with the Chavrusa, nothing else gets in. Because we're arguing most of the time, and I'm trying to prove he's wrong or learn that he's right, and going back, and when I think, shall I say this? But then he'll say that. If he says that, I'll say that, and I won't get there. And so I say something else. That's very absorbing, right? And thinking about worrying about money or taivas and so forth and so on, it just doesn't get in because my mind is full of that. So in that sense, you can control. Great tzaddikim, when they were walking from one place to another, would be reciting Mishnayos, Baal Peh, or reciting Musar, reciting Til and Baal Peh. Why? Because that's why my mind should be occupied. My mind is occupied. It's much more difficult. It's something to penetrate. So can you control? Yeah. You can control by taking the bull by the horns and pushing it on yourself. Now the same thing is true with happiness, joy, which involves pleasure, but goes far beyond pleasure. If does Hashem b'simcha, so serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu with joy, every mitzvah. And since, well, let me say it better. Not every mitzvah, every avoda. There's some avoda which isn't mitzvahs. Look at the Rabbi Hilchos Deos, and look at the Ramchal. In Derech Hashem, life divides up into mitzvos and things you have to do to be able to do mitzvos. Both are avoda. So that means the ideal life is avoda 24/7, 365. No time off. Everything is sleeping is avoda. I'm sleeping now, I set my alarm clock, so that tomorrow I'll be rested and be able to do. So the sleeping is avoda. Everything is avoda. Dovid HaMelech didn't say do mitzvahs with simcha. He said, Ivdu as Hashem b'simcha. Oh, where does the simcha come from? So some of it is in concentrating on my relationship with the Kodesh Baruch Hu, closeness, feeling ki ato imodi, like Dovid HaMelech says, you're with me continuously, and that generates. So by that thought, you could generate the simcha. Simcha involves pleasure, so you can definitely do that with your thing. And there, it's a mitzvah to do it. So I would say certainly it's a possibility. I don't know how common it would be, but it's definitely a possibility. Yeah.
This topic was brought up a couple times of the forefathers keeping the Torah, and a question in regards to Yaakov marrying two sisters.
So the Ramban talks about this. How could Jacob marry two sisters if the patriarchs kept all the mitzvahs? The Ramban's answer is that, this is a deep answer, there's lots of ramifications, that they only volunteered to keep the mitzvahs of the Torah, because this was voluntary, they weren't commanded, in the land of Israel. They didn't volunteer to keep it outside the land of Israel. Jacob married two sisters outside the land of Israel. And when he came back, Rachel died. She died at the first possible moment in giving birth to Binyamin. Now, okay, I'll skip some of the references, but the deep explanation, says the Ramban, is that the mitzvahs of the Torah, as opposed to the mitzvahs of Bnei Noach, non-Jews, the mitzvahs of the Torah are like the etiquette of living in the palace of the king. The laws of the country govern what you do on the street. When you move into the palace, there are all sorts of rules of living in the king's palace. The land of Israel is like the king's palace. All of us understood that the laws of the Torah, above and beyond what the general laws are for the whole of humanity, the laws of the Torah are like the special etiquette of living in the palace of the king. And therefore they volunteered to keep those laws only in the land of Israel. Now you'll say, well, if that's so, Rabbi, do you have to keep, let's say, Shabbos in New York? New York is in the palace of the king, and New York is one of those special mitzvahs of the Torah. And the answer is, yes, you do, because legally, HaKadosh Baruch Hu made it obligatory to keep Shabbos in New York, but not for the same reason. Not for the same reason and not for the same effect. Keeping Shabbos in New York is very different from keeping Shabbos in the land of Israel. And indeed, there's Rashi in the second paragraph of Shema and Chumash bringing a Chazal, which says, see, the second paragraph of Shema has a very interesting structure. It starts off with, if you do well, things will go well. Then it says, if you do ill, things will go ill. And then it says, by the way, here are some mitzvahs that you should do, and then things will go well. So you got good, bad, good. And going back to what you said at the beginning, the sensitive reader will say, why build it like a sandwich? You know, good, bad, good. Why not put all the good on one side and put the bad separately? Why put it in between? So Chazal thought of that, and they said, the last thing in the middle section of bad is Golos, going to exile. And the implication is, even when you go into exile, you should keep the mitzvahs of the Torah. Some mitzvahs anyway. And it gives a list of some of the mitzvahs. Now, a little piece of logic. When you say, even A, you should do B, even under condition A, you should do B, it means two things. It means, number one, A is a reason not to do B. It is. And therefore, you would have a good havamina, quite a natural thought that, well, if A is what's happening, then I shouldn't do B. That's one thing. But in fact, it's not true. Something overrides it. So when they say, even outside the land of Israel should keep these mitzvahs, you think, well, being outside is a reason not to, but the Torah tells me there's something more important than that reason, and that's why you should. Okay. So what's the reason to think not? This is where the Ramban comes in. The reason is because the mitzvahs are really for the palace, and New York isn't in the palace, so it shouldn't apply there. Okay. But even so, the Torah tells us, you should. Rashi quotes a Chazal. It says, so that when you come back, it shouldn't be new. Shlo yichadoshim. It shouldn't be new. What does that mean? When you come back, they shouldn't be new. Well, the Maharal, wrote the Guru Aryeh's Perish on Rashi, explains as follows. There's only one place that mitzvos come from, and that's from Moshe Rabbeinu. All mitzvahs come from Moshe Rabbeinu. We do not do bris milah because of Abraham. He says in the Parish of Mishnayos and Chulin. We don't refrain from the Gid Anosha because Yaakov was injured in that part of the body. That's not true. We do it because Moshe Rabbeinu commanded us to. We say it at bris milah lahachnisa b'risa shalom avinu. We're inducting him into the covenant of Abraham. That's right. We're inducting him into the covenant of Abraham because Moses said to do that. Otherwise, wouldn't be applied to us. The Torah comes from Moshe Rabbeinu. All mitzvahs come from Moshe Rabbeinu. Okay, so now, so what would happen, says the Maharal, if the rule was like this? You're in Eretz Israel, you keep the laws of the palace. You leave Eretz Israel, you stop keeping the laws of the palace. You're not in the palace anymore. The whole of the Jewish nation goes into exile. The whole of the Jewish nation stops keeping the laws of the palace. We then become, our responsibilities are the same as non-Jews. And then we come back. What will happen? Those mitzvahs will come into force. That would be a new beginning. That can't be. There are no new beginnings. You can only have a relevance to Torah if you're connected to Moses all the time. That's what it means when Chazal said they shouldn't be new. Because if they're really new, then you can't have them. So the purpose of keeping Shabbos in New York is so that when you come back into the land of Israel, it won't be new, so that you can have Israel when you have Shabbos when you come back. The purpose of Shabbos in New York is to keep the continuity that enables you to have Shabbos when you come back. Shabbos is made for Yerushalayim, for Tiberia, for Beersheba. It's not made for New York. It's obligatory in New York, but only to protect the possibility of having it when you come back. So although it is obligatory and the punishment is the same for violation, the purpose is entirely different. It's entirely different. All mitzvos have a different character in the land of, not only the mitzvah tulis ba'aretz, agricultural mitzvos. All mitzvos have an entirely different effect. That's why we say, other things being equal, and other things equal is not a joke, it's an important qualification, you live here. If other things are equal, you belong here. You have no excuse not to be here. Because the whole significance of your avoda, what you do, is entirely different. So that's the idea of the importance of keeping. So, when the Avos volunteered to keep the Torah, they volunteered to keep it in the land of Israel. This secondary effect of maintaining continuity, so that after exile you'll also be connected, you can come back, that they didn't volunteer to incorporate into their responsibilities. And by the way, who were Moses' parents? Amram and Yocheved. She was his aunt, as they say. Right? Well, that's not a person merciful according to the Torah, but that was in Egypt. So that's the Ramban's answer to that question.
Part of the idea too that when we're in New York, we keep Shabbos for the sake of forming a habit of keeping Shabbos, like you're saying before. You want consistency, or that's
no. It's I see. You have to be careful with categories. I didn't say anything psychological at all.
That's
not a single word that I said had to do with psychology. It had to do with metaphysics. It had to do with the fact that the only source of Torah obligation is Moses. If you become disconnected from Moses, it's over. It's over. You can never get it back. The only source is Moses. So what Chazal are teaching us is the mitzvahs that you keep in exile, even though you're in exile, are for the sake of remaining attached to Moses so that you can be related to Moses' Torah when you come back. That has nothing to do with psychology. And by the way, although I saw this written in some English sources, I don't know where they're coming from, it's not a question of memory. First of all, lots of mitzvahs, they don't have to keep like Tumah and Tara, which is 25% of all Mishnayos are in purity and defilement, and you're not required to keep those laws. You're not required to keep the agricultural laws. What's about memory? What's about the habit, and so on and so on? That's not it. That's not even close. It's a question of that connection, and the Kodesh Baruch Hu chose the mitzvahs with which that connection is maintained.
How is the connection in any way different when we're in Israel, though?
How is the connection any different in Israel? I understand. You're living in the palace of the king. Living in New York, you're not living in the palace of the king. Mm-hmm. That's the starting point, right? The question is, what effect should that have on your performance of mitzvahs? Yes. And the first thought is, well, then you shouldn't have to do them there because this is the etiquette of the palace. Mm-hmm. And the overpowering answer is, it is the etiquette of the palace, but you can't get back into the palace unless you keep it in New York also. Why? Because you have to be connected to Moses. Not because you'll forget, not because you need to have habits. It's not psychological. It's legal metaphysical. You're not connected to the source. Everything comes through Moshe Rabbeinu. It doesn't come from any other source. Okay. All right.